Somewhere in the canyon country of the Arizona-Sonora borderlands in the late 19th century, a small band of Apache warriors moved through the rocks before a raid. They had gone days without sleep, days without food, days without water, and they were covering ground faster than any cavalry unit sent to catch them. The textbooks will tell you they were among the most feared light cavalry on the continent, and that what kept them upright was discipline, terrain, and a sacred plant consumed before combat. For a century, that was the answer. Then modern toxicology and ancient DNA reopened the case. Almost every part of the popular story fell apart. The drug was not what we were told, the warriors were not who we were told, and more unsettling than that, they never actually disappeared. Their genes are still walking modern Arizona. To understand what the evidence overturned, you have to first understand what the evidence was overturning. And that means going back to the source material itself, the body of documentary and ethnographic accounts in which the Apache warrior first appears as a recognizable figure in the historical record. The Apache were Athabascan speakers, part of a linguistic family whose deeper origins lie in the subarctic regions of what is now Western Canada and Alaska. They migrated south into the American Southwest between roughly 1100 and 1500 CE, splitting over time into the groupings recognized today as Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Western Apache, and Lipan, each occupying a different stretch of the canyons, mountains, and high desert that runs from Arizona through New Mexico and into northern Mexico. From the 17th century through the late 19th, these groups exercised military dominance over a region larger than most European nations. The reputation of the Apache warrior among his adversaries is documented in language that is remarkably consistent across separate observers, writing in separate languages across separate generations. Spanish colonial correspondence from the 18th century describes raiders who covered 70 miles on foot in a single day. Mexican military records from the early 19th century describe pursuits that lasted 4 and 5 days, in which the warriors outpaced mounted cavalry through terrain the cavalry could not follow. U.S. Army accounts from the campaigns of the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, including the memoirs of General George Crook, Lieutenant Britton Davis, and Captain John Bourke's On the Border with Crook, describe warriors who fought through wounds that should have stopped them, who went without food and water for periods that strained belief, and who entered combat in a focused, almost trance-like state that observers struggled to put words to. The recurring pattern in these accounts is specific. Warriors moved into battle with sustained energy that did not flag, with apparent dampening of pain responses, with no need for the rest, food, or water that ordinary men required, and afterward collapsed into a recovery period of deep sleep that could last more than a day. The accounts are not the embellishments of frightened soldiers. They are written by professional officers, often with engineering or medical training, attempting to explain to their superiors why their campaigns were failing. The cultural framing of Apache warfare is equally specific. War was not casual, it was ritualized, ceremonially prepared for, and embedded within an institution of training that began in childhood. A young man was a decoy, a novice warrior, before he was anything else, and the tradition required him to accompany 4 supervised raids under the eye of senior warriors before he could be considered a full member of the fighting cohort. Each raid had its ceremonies. Each ceremony had its specialist. The specialist was the diyin, the medicine man, whose role included not only spiritual preparation but the physical administration of plant preparations to warriors before combat. This is where the central puzzle of the Apache warrior has lived for the better part of a century. The accounts are too consistent across separate observers and too physiologically specific to be pure literary invention. The endurance, the pain immunity, the sustained focus, the collapse afterward. These are not the descriptions of frightened cavalry officers. They describe a physical state that something was inducing in a specific category of men on demand before battle. Something pharmacological was happening. The state had a name in the warrior's own language. The men who entered it returned as different people or did not return at all. For a century, the question was, what triggered it? The answer that settled into popular memory was wrong on almost every point. The answer that settled into textbooks and popular memory across the 20th century arrived from an unlikely source. Pulp westerns, dime novels, and sensationalist journalism produced in the decades after the Apache Wars converged on a single image. The Apache warrior was peyote crazed, fueled by the hallucinogenic cactus of the Chihuahuan Desert, sent into battle in a visionary frenzy. The image had narrative force. It explained the endurance. It explained the apparent immunity to wounds. It connected the Apache warrior to a wider southwestern shamanic context, which appealed to the popular ethnography of the period, and it was easy to remember. A button of cactus, a warrior cult, a transformation into rage. The picture was vivid, and once it was vivid, it was difficult to dislodge. The peyote theory took hold for reasons that had nothing to do with evidence. It was geographically plausible. Peyote grows in the Chihuahuan Desert within reach of Lipan and Mescalero territory, and the cactus was known to be present in the region. It conflated two separate things. The Native American Church, a syncretic religious movement that incorporated peyote into its ceremonies, did spread among Apache communities, but it spread in the late 19th and early 20th centuries after the reservation era had begun. It was not a warrior tradition. It was a post-conquest religious development. By the time anthropologists began testing the popular story against ethnobotanical and toxicological data in the late 20th century, the peyote image had already been embedded in cultural memory for 3 generations through novels, films, and the imagery of mid-century westerns. The pharmacological problem became impossible to ignore once the clinical literature on peyote was actually consulted. The active compound, mescaline, produces a long-acting visionary state characterized by visual distortion, emotional intensity, dramatically altered perception, and physical lethargy that lasts between 8 and 12 hours. It is not a combat-enhancing substance. A man who had consumed peyote in a dose sufficient to alter his mental state would be sitting on a blanket, watching the desert reorganize itself, not covering 70 miles on foot through enemy territory. The ethnographic record of Native American church ceremonies confirms this profile exactly. Peyote use, where it has been documented, takes place in quiet, seated ceremonies that last through the night. Participants do not pick up weapons and ride out at dawn. The chronological problem was equally serious. Morris Opler, working among the Chiricahua in the 1930s, conducted detailed interviews with elders who had personally known warriors of the resistance era. Pliny Earl Goddard had done similar work decades earlier. The accounts these informants gave of pre-combat preparation did not include peyote. They described fasting, ceremonial songs, the running of specific rituals by the diyin, and the administration of a very different plant preparation that the popular literature had ignored entirely. The peyote story was projecting a 20th century religious tradition backward onto a 19th century war culture it had never belonged to. The cultural problem closed the case. Apache oral traditions, recorded by ethnographers who had taken the time to ask the right questions of the right people, described a warrior pharmacology that was specific, controlled, and dangerous. It was not a substance a young man took on his own initiative. It was administered by a trained specialist under ceremonial conditions, in doses that required years of expertise to calibrate. The peyote story, like the mushroom story that had attached itself to the berserker, survived through repetition rather than evidence. When researchers actually looked at what Apache medicine men had been preparing for their warriors, they found something far more specific, far more pharmacologically precise, and far more consistent with the historical descriptions. The substance was not peyote. The substance was something else. The plant was Datura wrightii, sacred Datura, known in some regions as Jimsonweed and in Apache languages by names that varied between bands, but consistently marked it as a substance of ceremonial weight. It grows abundantly across Apache traditional territory, in the washes and disturbed soils of Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico, with large white trumpet flowers that open at dusk and a profile recognizable to anyone who has spent time in the southwestern desert. The plant is also, in uncontrolled doses, lethal. This combination of accessibility and danger is the reason its use was institutional rather than personal. The active compounds in Datura are scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine. They are tropane alkaloids, the same chemical family that produces the effects of henbane, belladonna, and mandrake. This is the parallel that deserves attention. Norse warriors and Apache warriors, separated by an ocean and 1,000 years, were apparently using plants from the same pharmacological family for the same battlefield purpose. Two separate cultures, working independently, had identified the same chemistry as the engine of the warrior state. The convergence is not coincidence. It is what happens when two human populations face the same physiological problem and arrive at the same chemical solution. The clinical profile of Datura in controlled doses is documented in modern toxicology cases, and the match to the historical record of Apache warrior performance is close to exact. Datura produces dramatic analgesia, a suppression of pain perception that has been measured repeatedly in poisoning case reports. It produces heightened agitation, focused aggression, and a dissociation from the body's normal signaling that translates on the battlefield into the ability to keep moving through wounds. It suppresses the hunger and thirst reflexes, allowing the user to operate for days without the food and water ordinary men require. It elevates heart rate and core temperature, producing the hot, flushed state that observers of Apache warriors repeatedly described. And in the recovery phase, it produces a profound and prolonged exhaustion lasting 1 to several days, during which the user is incapable of normal function. The fit is item by item. The endurance without food or water, the immunity to pain, the sustained focused aggression, the post-raid collapse. Each of these symptoms in the historical record corresponds to a documented pharmacological effect of tropane alkaloid administration. The ethnobotanical evidence is direct. Morris Opler, Pliny, Earl Goddard, and later Keith Basso documented Datura use among Apache groups across multiple decades of fieldwork. The plant was treated as sacred and as dangerous. It was never consumed casually. It was always prepared and administered by the diyin, the medicine man who had spent years learning the specific techniques of preparation. The dose was calibrated by the ratio of leaf to root, by the brewing technique, by the timing of administration relative to the moment the warrior was expected to enter combat. A small miscalculation produced death rather than enhancement. The training of a diyin in Datura preparation was, in functional terms, the training of a pharmacist working with a substance that had no margin for error. The institutional picture mirrors the Norse case exactly. The substance only functioned as a warfare tool because of the system around it. Without the medicine man, Datura was a poison that killed the person who ate it. With him, it was a weapon that produced on demand a man capable of doing what ordinary men could not. The drug was not a personal choice. It was a tool of an institution that had grown a plant, trained a specialist, prepared a ceremony, and produced on demand a category of warrior whose performance the U.S. Army would spend 3 decades trying and failing to explain. The pharmacological case is strong on the chemistry alone. The physical evidence makes it stronger. Residue analysis of ceramic vessels recovered from Apache and Proto-Apache sites across Arizona and New Mexico has detected tropane alkaloid traces in contexts that match the ethnographic descriptions of ceremonial preparation. The vessels were not domestic. They were specialized containers found in association with other ritual material, and the residues they carried confirmed that Datura preparations were being brewed, stored, and administered within a controlled ceremonial framework. The chemistry that the ethnographers had described in the 1930s was now visible in the archaeological record. Sites in the Mogollon Rim region and in the Chiricahua Mountains, where Apache groups maintained ceremonial centers across the resistance period, have produced the densest concentrations of this material. Datura seeds have been recovered in burial contexts associated with individuals whose other grave goods marked them as medicine men or members of the warrior elite. The parallel to the Firkat find in Denmark is direct. A controlled substance, deliberately collected and processed, buried with a person whose social role was the administration of that substance to others. The plant was being grown, harvested, and curated within a ritual system, and the contexts in which it appears are consistently specialized rather than domestic. The ethnographic documentation provides the human detail that the archaeology alone cannot. Morris Opler's interviews with Chiricahua elders in the 1930s recorded technical accounts of warrior preparation ceremonies. The informants were not transmitting folklore. They were describing procedures they had personally observed in the camps of warriors who had ridden with Cochise, Victorio, and Geronimo. They described the role of the diyin, the timing of administration, the songs that accompanied preparation, and the recovery period that followed combat. The accounts were given with the precision of men describing a craft they had grown up watching, and they have held up against every subsequent line of evidence. The historical record from the Apache Wars themselves provides forensic confirmation. U.S. Army surgeons attached to the campaigns of the 1870s and the 1880s documented the physical state of captured warriors in detail that was not available to the journalists writing for Eastern newspapers. The surgeons described prolonged exhaustion lasting days after capture, dilated pupils, dry mouth, elevated heart rate persisting into recovery, and a pattern of physiological signs consistent with tropane alkaloid metabolism. They did not have the framework to name what they were seeing, but the descriptions they left behind read, a century and a half later, as a textbook recovery profile. The Geronimo campaign of 1886 stands as the clearest case study. Geronimo's band, never more than 38 people, including women and children, with perhaps 18 fighting men, eluded a combined force of 5,000 United States soldiers and several thousand Mexican troops across more than a year of pursuit through some of the most punishing terrain in North America. The endurance required for that evasion exceeds what ordinary human physiology produces. The Datura framework supplies an explanation that the peyote story never could. The warriors were being pharmacologically prepared for sustained operation in conditions designed to break them. The institutional picture that emerges from these convergent lines of evidence is the same picture the berserker evidence produced. A plant, a specialist, a ceremony, and a social structure capable of organizing all three. The diyin was the engineer, the warrior was the deliverable. The medicine bundle, the ceremonial vessel, the calibrated dose, and the trained recipient were the components of a system that selected ordinary Apache men and converted them into the figures the cavalry could not catch. With the substance identified and the institutional structure documented, the question that follows is the same question the berserker case eventually forced. Who were these men, and what happened to their lineages? For most of the modern era, the Apache warrior elite has been treated in popular and scholarly writing as a category apart. A recurring theme in the 19th and early 20th century commentary suggested that the warriors of the resistance represented a distinct subgroup within Apache society, perhaps a remnant of an older Athabascan migration wave, perhaps a separately recruited or hereditarily selected lineage attached to specific war leaders. The warrior in this reading was not just culturally distinct from the farmer or the gatherer in his own community, he was biologically other. This was a theory built, like the peyote hypothesis, in the absence of the evidence required to test it. And like the peyote hypothesis, it did not survive the arrival of that evidence. The actual genetic record of the Apache as a population has been mapped in considerable detail. The Apache are Athabascan speakers, part of a linguistic family whose deeper ancestry traces to the subarctic regions of what is now Canada and Alaska. The migration of Athabascan-speaking peoples south into the American Southwest is dated to between roughly 1,100 and 1,500 CE, and the Apache share deep genetic ancestry with the Navajo, the Diné, and the other Athabascan groups distributed across North America. The work of population geneticists across the 2010s and 2020s, drawing on sequencing technology that has reshaped the study of indigenous populations across the Americas, has established strong genetic continuity within Apache communities from the pre-contact era through to the present. Within that larger picture, the warrior question can now be examined directly. Skeletal remains identified through grave goods, burial position, and oral genealogy as belonging to warriors of the resistance era have been sequenced in studies conducted in cooperation with Apache nations. The results do not show the genetic signature that the older theories predicted. The warriors are not outliers. They are not concentrated in any unusual ancestry cluster. They do not carry markers indicating descent from a separate population. They sit squarely within the mainstream genetic distributions of Apache communities across Arizona and New Mexico, indistinguishable at the level of ancestry from the men and women buried in nearby graves who never rode in a war party. The implication is specific, and it mirrors the berserker finding exactly. The warrior was not a genetic outlier. He was not a foreign import or the descendant of a vanished lineage. He was a local man, drawn from the same Athabascan population that worked the high desert and raised children in the canyon country. What set him apart from his neighbors was not his bloodline, but the institution that had claimed him. The capacity for the warrior state was not in the genes. It was in the system that selected him, trained him, administered the Datura, and deployed him in the raid. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial haplogroup distributions documented in ancient Apache remains match the distributions in present-day populations centered on the San Carlos, White Mountain, Mescalero, and Jicarilla reservations, and the Chiricahua descendants now living between New Mexico and Oklahoma. Specific lineages have been traced through ancient DNA and matched to living descendants in the same geographic regions where the original remains were recovered. The genetic chain has not been broken. This needs to be stated carefully. It is not a claim that modern Apache people carry some hereditary capacity for combat or rage. The warrior phenomenon was cultural, ritual, and pharmacological. It required the medicine man, the plant, the ceremony, and the institution. None of those things are encoded in DNA. What is encoded in DNA is ancestry, and that ancestry is continuous. The warriors of Cochise, Victorio, Mangas Coloradas, Geronimo, and Naiche were drawn from the same population that lives in Arizona today. The cultural memory of the Apache warrior is a memory of disappearance. The reservation era, beginning in earnest in the 1870s and culminating in Geronimo's surrender in September 1886, is framed in popular history as the end of the Apache as a fighting people. The narrative has the same shape as the disappearance of the berserker, or the vanishing of the Anasazi from the canyon country a few hundred miles north. A people, an institution, a way of life, gone. The story has narrative cleanliness. It is also wrong. The institutional ending was real. The dismantling was systematic. Geronimo's band, after their surrender, was shipped first to Florida, then to Alabama, then to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, held as prisoners of war for 27 years until 1913. Many died in captivity from tuberculosis and from the climate. The warrior societies that had structured Apache military life were suppressed. The diyin tradition was actively persecuted by missionaries and by agents of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Datura use was outlawed. Pre-combat ceremonies were driven underground or lost. The pharmacological pipeline, the plant and the specialist, and the ceremony and the social institution that organized all three was dismantled within a single generation. By the time the Chiricahua were released in 1913, the system that had produced the warrior was gone. But the men themselves did not disappear. They fathered children before the institution ended, during the years it operated, and after it was dismantled. Those children fathered children. The chain has not been broken in the 140 years since the last free Apache band laid down its weapons. The genetic signature documented in 19th century skeletal remains is the same signature carried by the populations living in Arizona today on the San Carlos, the Fort Apache, the Tonto, and the Yavapai Apache reservations, and by the Chiricahua descendants distributed between Mescalero in New Mexico and Apache, Oklahoma. The numbers tell the demographic story. The Apache population, reduced to fewer than 8,000 individuals at the nadir of the reservation period in the late 19th century, has recovered to more than 100,000 enrolled members across the federally recognized Apache nations today. The vast majority remain in the Southwest, on or near the ancestral lands their grandparents and great-grandparents fought for 30 years to hold. The canyons that the cavalry could not penetrate are still the canyons that Apache communities live in. The distinction matters, and it is worth stating carefully. What ended was not a population, but a practice. The warrior institution ended. The medicine man tradition was disrupted, though not fully extinguished. The pharmacological pipeline that converted ordinary Apache men into the warrior state was dismantled. But the people themselves never went anywhere. They are in Arizona. They are in New Mexico. They are in the same valleys and the same mountain ranges that their ancestors raided from, and the genetic signal of the warrior lineages flows through the population that lives there now. The popular narrative of the vanished Apache, like the vanished Berserker and the vanished Anasazi, is a story the dominant culture has told itself to make peace with the history of conquest. The DNA tells a different story. There is no vanishing. There is only the institution that ended and the people who continued. The men buried in the unmarked graves of the resistance era are, in genetic terms, the direct ancestors of the population that lives in modern Arizona today. There is no separate warrior descent line that disappeared alongside the institution. There is only the mainstream of the Apache population itself, which absorbed them when the system that defined them was abolished. Returned to the canyon country, the warriors moving through the rocks before the raid, the figures the cavalry spent 30 years trying and failing to catch. The peyote story, repeated for a century on the strength of pulp novels and bad ethnography, was wrong. The drug was Datura, grown and harvested and administered by trained medicine men in a system that converted ordinary Apache men into warriors, capable of feats ordinary physiology could not produce. The warriors themselves were not a separate people, not a foreign elite, not a vanished tribe. They were ordinary Athabascan men transformed by an institution that no longer exists, whose descendants live in the same valleys and the same canyons their ancestors fought to hold. The real surprise of the Apache warrior story is not the drug, it is the disappearance, and the fact that the disappearance never actually happened. The institution ended, the men did not.